were simply in the pay of the West. And he wanted this analysis to finish soon. He didn't want a Majlis Muassisan to be elected with 600-700 members, and the election would take months, and the proceedings, in his view, would take 3 or 4 years. And by that time, his powers and probably the revolution would be considerably weakened. So he wasn't in favor of this, and he was for Islami shodan sari mamlakat, in order to sum it up. And another attack in subsequent days, he would say that the people who are in favor of Majlis Muassisan are against Islam. But who exactly was in favor of Majlis Khobregan? Well, one of the people who was in favor of it and remained in favor of it was Ayatollah Osman Shari Madari, which we heard about earlier. Shari Madari was in favor of Majlis Muassisan. He always stated that not convening a wide Majlis Muassisan composed by hundreds of people would be a grave mistake. And he made these comments publicly in the days after Khomeini made his comments about the Majlis Muassisan, which we just saw. So this was an open confrontation between the two. And progressively, as the day goes by, and in these days, after 25 of Khordad, Khomeini gave a speech every day on the Peshmergas and on the question of forming the constitution. And progressively, he just starts to float away from it. For example, he doesn't give any explicit support for the Peshmergas. He calls his supporters to examine each article and see to what extent it is compatible with Islam, implying that he didn't really pay attention to it. And then he states that anyone who's an expert in Islam should assess whether this or that article is compatible with Islam or not. And on the 3rd of Mordad, finally, Khomeini warns that possibly the creation of an American or European constitution is in the making, and this should be avoided. And we shall see after this series of who listened to Khomeini's advice in order to produce an Islamic critique of this constitution. And this is a part of his Saif-e-Imam in which he states these things. What happened to the Khordad text? How did the decision proceed on what to do with it? Well, according to various memoirs by the Nehzat Azadi, by Rafsanjani, by Abul Hassan Bani Sad, there was an important meeting of all the main people who were then in government in Qom to decide the final process to which the constitution had to be formally approved. This meeting took place on the 2nd of Khordad in Qom. And the result of it, here is Ayatollah Taliqani, who stated that they had a 6-hour important session with Khomeini then. And the result of it was, again, this is Dovom Khordad, 20 days before the publication of the Khordad text. The result of it was that the decision was made to publish the text in the middle of Khordad and then go towards the creation eventually of a Majlis Khobregan, which was different from the Muassisan in that it was composed only by around 70 people, and it had only 1 month to go through the text, come up with the final version, and put it forward to referendum. So considerably less than what the supporters of Majlis Muassisan, such as Ayatollah Shari Madari or Mohandes Bazagan, were stating. Taliqani had stated here that the constitution would be approved, would be produced within a week of the 3rd of Khordad. That means the 10th of Khordad. It actually was leaked, not officially published by Kayhan on the 24th of Khordad. This means that there was still a lot of editing happening to it in this time frame. And this is the text from Kayhan on the 24th of Khordad. It is therefore unclear whether they were discussing the final text during this meeting. So what happened after Khomeini made all those remarks against the Peshmergas at the end of Khordad and the beginning of Mordad? The person who really heeded to Khomeini's advice more than anyone else was Ayatollah Montazeri. And he came out with a very detailed critique of the constitution, again on an article-by-article basis, which went far beyond what Khomeini had done in March on the previous text, on the Esfand text. And for example, in part of this critique, which is published in Montazeri's Khatarat, if anyone is interested, you can see that he's against a full reliance on popular elections, on elections as the foundation for the government. And he says that there has to be a limitation of popular sovereignty within Islamic principles. This went in complete contrast with what, for example, Ayatollah Sharmadari was saying at the time. This is an interview by him around the same time frame in Mordad, in which he states openly that Hakimiyat ba millat ast, and that snippet down there is very interesting, and he states that even if the communists win elections, they have the right to rule. And no other member of the clergy quite says this in such openness at that time. According to Montazeri and his detailed analysis, in this detailed analysis, which was published in Tir and Mordad before the Assembly of Experts took place, the Faqih Adel has to be at the helm of the Islamic State, and due to this he calls for several important articles of the Khordad text to be subject to significant modification. And this is basically the text of what he states. And he also complains that the clergy do not have any right of veto anymore in the text published by Bazagan's government. And basically what he states here is that eventually there has to be an implementation of the principle of Vilayat Faqih within the constitution. In these critiques, which were again published before the start of the Assembly of Experts, Montazeri does not yet make a full-blown case for the inclusion of a separate institution accommodating the Vilayat Faqih above all the other institutions which were defined by the constitution of Khordad. He doesn't make this yet, but however he remains openly in favor of the inclusion of Vilayat Faqih in the constitution. And Montazeri has a negative attitude towards the presidency throughout, and part of this insistence of his for the inclusion of the role of the Faqih Adel within the state comes across by the fact that, for example, he believed that Ayatollah Khomeini would never become the president. It was his belief that, and at the time when other people allied or supportive of Khomeini were naming him as the first president of the Islamic Republic, and for example, the Sazman Mujahideen Khalq would nominate him formally as the president later on, as the candidate for the first presidency, Montazeri was steadfast against it, and he thought that simply Khomeini would never accept it. And he was against this strong president who he was fearful would turn into a Goldor, as you can see. And then again, he was, at some point he came out with statements against an individual presidency, and he claimed that the presidency should be a council. But there were other clerics who were involved in criticisms. One of them was Yahya Nouri, who is not very famous now, but at the beginning of the revolution, prior to Khomeini's return to Iran, he had a famous debate with Mustafa Raimi now in the Ghan again about the Hukumat Islami. Mustafa Raimi was one of the very few intellectuals that came out with an open letter against the establishment of a Jumhuriya Islami. Yahya Nouri came against him. Now he came back again and he wrote that the Pishnawis is neither Islamic nor revolutionary. It is modeled more on Montesquieu and unapplicable socialism and less on the Quran, and is actually much weaker than the Mashruta constitution. This was the criticism that, by the way, even the Hezb Zahmat Keshan produced regarding the June text. And this was his article against it. As we said earlier, Ayatollah Sharimadari was in favor of the Majlis Muassisan. He came out strongly in favor of it after Khomeini's text. And then there was a relatively unknown cleric called Sayyid Muhammad Khatami, who later would become more famous. And he argued in an editorial for Etelat newspaper that the Khordad text was nothing more than an attempt to impose on the nation what Shapur Bakhtiar had in mind after the Shah's departure from Iran. And he stated, contrary to Montazeri, and we can see the difference between them, that if really there has to be a president, a strong, a unitary president, well, that person has to be Imam Khomeini. And he also stated that the president should not operate alone. There should be a new council called the Council of Mujtahids, whose only role would be to supervise on the president all the time. So the president was a sort of a child which could not be left out of the house alone. Well, it's interesting how Khatami later became president, and once he became president, he was not in favor of a council of mujtahids to supervise himself. And this is part of his criticism. This appeared in a commentary article on Etelat newspaper, so it had a lot of circulation. And this is another part of Khatami's article. what happens? So as we said in Khordad, at the beginning of Khordad, there was